She was ordered to stand, called out by name, and told to explain company losses she didn't cause. While every executive in the room stared at her like she was a stain they couldn't scrub off, the only black woman in a sea of polished privilege, humiliated with precision. No warning, no mistake, just pure, calculated targeting disguised as corporate routine. They mocked her body language, her voice, her presence, stripping her dignity piece by piece under the cold glare of office lights. What they didn't know was that behind her silence was a sealed document with more power than all of them combined. This isn't just about one woman fighting back. It's about the moment quiet becomes dangerous. And when the truth hits, it doesn't knock. It crashes. If that first twist hit you, like and subscribe to follow the fallout. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. Let me know what you think is coming next, because it only gets darker from here. Lenora Voss arrived at the granite and glass headquarters of Hallbrook Systems at precisely 7:53 a.m., the way she had every weekday for the last 8 years. She walked with a practiced calm, shoes clicking crisply on polished tile, her thermos snug in hand, the rhythm of a disciplined routine uninterrupted by weather or sleep. She wasn't flashy. Her navy coat was sensible. Her blouse was a shade too dull for the marketing team, but too refined for operations. That was her space, efficient, deliberate, invisible. She swiped her ID badge at the executive wing elevator and waited. Nothing happened. The scanner flashed red. She swiped again, red again. A third time, still red. She glanced over her shoulder, eyes calm but narrowed. She walked to the staircase, for flights up, her breath measured, heels steady. On the executive floor, she tried the door access panel. Another red blink. Denied. Only after she stepped back did she notice a younger man in a navy vest approaching, a security in turn she didn't recognize. He didn't offer his name. He simply gestured for her to follow. She didn't ask questions, though every muscle in her jaw twitched with restraint. He led her down 2 flights below ground, past the server cooling zones and into a corridor she hadn't walked since her orientation tour. At the end of it, a low metal door opened into a chilled, windowless room that still smelled faintly of mildew and paint. Inside were 2 metal filing cabinets, humming quietly under a backup cooling fan, and a single desk bolted to the floor. No windows, no phone, no computer. A printed memo was centered on the desk in 11-point Arial. Transition assignment reclassification pending. No name, no signature, just the word pending, bolded twice. Her nameplate from her former desk was missing. The intern excused himself without eye contact. She stood still. 10 seconds. 30. Then she stepped inside and shut the door behind her. The latch made a sound like a final decision. Her badge no longer worked for any floor above ground. The cafeteria required mobile pay or authorized scan. She had neither. Her logins for the company email system timed out. She tried twice, then stopped. She requested a monitor and laptop through the equipment portal, but the confirmation page returned a system error with no contact info. She borrowed a landline at the front desk and called IT. Her extension was no longer recognized. Her name had vanished from the internal user tree. Co-workers she trained walked past her in the hall without recognition. Even maintenance addressed her like a stranger. By Wednesday, she stopped trying to log in. Her desk upstairs had been reassigned by Thursday. A new analyst, named Callie, sat there now, fresh from grad school, chattering to the marketing team with a voice that bounced like a rubber ball. Lenora walked by once, saw her framed degrees still boxed on the floor, and kept walking. That evening, she saw Dorian Wexler by the mezzanine espresso machine. He looked up, recognized her, and gave the kind of tight-lipped smile used at funerals and airport delays. When she asked what had happened to her clearance, he gave a half shrug and said something about systemic calibration that didn't apply to anyone else. Then he turned and walked away. She returned to the archive. The archive was cold. Not freezing, but always cold. The humming overhead filled the silence with a pulse that never changed. She learned its rhythm the way you learn a hallway creak in a childhood home. Every morning, she made coffee using an old travel kettle in the utility sink. She sat at the metal desk and reviewed files from a time before anyone upstairs had graduated high school. Carbon copies, punch cards, red stamped forms written by men who now sat on boards. She wrote notes in the margins, not because anyone would read them, but because handwriting soothed the sharp edge of erasure. Friday came with new insult. An internal memo titled Internal Zone Efficiency hit the shared corporate bulletin, signed by Dorian Wexler. It didn't name her, but it didn't have to. Terms like low noise reassignment and legacy position streamlining painted her exile in soft, bureaucratic poison. A receptionist printed the memo and handed it to her with a quiet, almost apologetic smile. Lenora took it without a word and walked back to the archive. She didn't eat lunch that day. Her bagged sandwich had gone missing from the communal fridge. She didn't ask who took it. Her record had never reflected lateness before. She read each line twice, then a third time, before folding the page with equal corners and slipping it into the top drawer beneath the stack of red-stamped contract forms. She knew she'd been early those days. She always was. But when she logged into the shared HR kiosk in the first-floor lounge using a temporary generic profile she wasn't meant to have access to, the time logs confirmed the claim. Her punch-ins were edited, 12, 15, 17 minutes late. The edits were tagged as manual corrections. No source noted. She returned to the basement and resumed her routine without expression, but her thoughts burned quietly. Time card manipulation wasn't just punitive, it was predictive. In this place, when the data turned on you, perception followed. And when perception changed, consequences became justifiable. The pattern was clear. First, remove her from view. Then undermine her credibility. Then quietly build the file to support an outcome already decided. But Lenora did not panic. She only sharpened her observations. That afternoon, her badge chirped green, unexpectedly, for a brief window when a company-wide morale session was held in the new multipurpose suite on level 2. She was surprised to be included, surprised to see her access suddenly reinstated for one room on one day. A sign-in clipboard at the door bore her name, but the greeter, an intern from Learning and Development, paused before saying it aloud, glancing at her badge, then just gesturing her inside. The suite was filled with rows of chairs, an overhead projector cycling through slides featuring smiling staff from every division. Celebrating every voice, the title read. The room buzzed with casual conversation and overenthusiastic team leaders attempting banter. Lenora sat in the back row. She knew she wouldn't be called on, but she wanted to see how her absence would be acknowledged. The opening slides showed employee spotlights, department recognitions, and mentorship milestones. She recognized many of the names, analysts she had trained, team leads she had once advised on budget cycles, interns she'd recommended for promotion. Her own face did not appear. When the slide titled, "Welcome to our family" rotated in, it listed 7 new hires, 2 returns from parental leave, and 1 contractor turned full-time. The list concluded with a bright message. Every person here matters. Her name was not there. What followed, however, made her fingers curl. Another slide titled Opportunities for Coaching listed 4 employees flagged for culture engagement support. Her name was third. The room didn't react loudly, but several heads turned her way, some confused, some amused, some simply indifferent. The facilitator did not elaborate. No explanation was given. It was merely a line on a slide, a passing signal that something was wrong with her performance, or maybe her attitude, or perhaps her capacity to fit. These meetings were crafted to feel casual, light, celebratory. But every word had weight. Every omission meant something. Every inclusion meant something more. When the group was split into teams for an exercise called perspective bridging, Lenora was placed with a group of marketing interns and a facilities coordinator she didn't know. The task was to share moments where workplace challenges helped shape personal growth. When it came to her turn, Lenora spoke 3 sentences about finding patience through transitions. No one responded. The group moved on. After the session, refreshments were served. Most attendees lingered in clusters, laughing over inside jokes and repeating favorite moments from the slideshow. Lenora waited by the hallway exit, cup of water in hand, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She heard someone ask if she was new. Another said no, she'd been around forever, but had a weird role now. She didn't correct them. When she returned to the basement archive, the badge chirped red again. Access revoked. The rest of the week followed with clinical cruelty. On Tuesday morning, her thermos was missing from the archive. Not stolen, but gone. Replaced on her desk was a white ceramic mug labeled visitor. It had a chip on the handle. On Wednesday, the security team stopped her at the elevator for a random check and asked to verify the contents of her bag. She had never been checked before. On Thursday, an envelope arrived with her name handwritten in lowercase cursive. Inside was a printed sheet titled Professional Mindfulness in Shifting Environments. The author was a contract coach who gave quarterly lectures on workplace emotional awareness. It included exercises like mindful eye contact, posture mapping, and a suggestion to reframe isolation as independence. No one signed it. She didn't need a signature to understand who sent it. That same afternoon, her time card recorded another late punch she didn't make. Her own attempts to override the entry were blocked. She considered confronting someone, Dorian maybe, or one of the floor managers who still remembered her. But each time she visualized the conversation, it ended the same way, in vague deflections, polite apologies, and silent escalations. The moment she raised her voice, she would fulfill the very narrative being written about her. Unstable, emotional, resistant to feedback. So she said nothing. By Friday, her formal HR file had a flag icon in the corner. She saw it briefly when the receptionist pulled up her profile to confirm her ID during a policy review. The flag meant she was under review, not formally reprimanded, not accused, but watched. Her performance record, once spotless, now had asterisks and supervisor comments that didn't match her history. When she inquired casually about the coaching slide at the morale meeting, the HR coordinator blinked, hesitated, then said those lists were algorithmically generated based on anonymous feedback and internal scores. Lenora asked what internal scores those were. The coordinator shrugged and said it was an evolving system. It was the sound of permission granted conditionally, of identity tolerated but not respected. When she entered the hallway that led to the basement stairwell, she noticed a few employees exiting the elevator and glancing her way. They didn't wave or smile. They didn't speak. But their eyes lingered just long enough to suggest recognition laced with something else, something colder, more amused. One of them whispered to the other before the doors closed. Lenora didn't slow her pace, but her gut coiled like a spring. Later that morning, when she logged into the shared public terminal on level 1 to access her benefits portal, she clicked by habit into the internal company directory. There, on the profile page linked to her employee ID, was a photo she hadn't seen in over a decade. It was from her internship at Hallbrook, taken the summer she had started college, wide-eyed, nervous, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a blazer 2 sizes too big and no makeup. The image was grainy, slightly pixelated, and undeniably youthful. Her previous headshot, the one she had taken just 2 years ago when she led analytics training for new hires, had been replaced without warning. The outdated photo didn't just diminish her presence, it changed her entirely. It made her look junior, unqualified, unfinished. It planted doubt. Later that day, 2 colleagues from finance passed her in the stairwell and gave her a strange look, one that hovered somewhere between curiosity and disbelief. She heard one of them mention her name, followed by a skeptical question about when she had graduated. The implication wasn't subtle. Someone had started a whisper that Lenora had misrepresented her resume, and now the visual proof had been engineered to support it. In a company where perception wrote history faster than facts, this was a calculated wound. The whispers grew louder by Wednesday. On her lunch break, what little she allowed herself between filing and note-taking, Lenora walked by the print room just in time to hear 2 junior consultants discussing a memo that bore her name. The memo, apparently sent from her account, had contained grammatical errors, a misquoted policy, and an incorrect deadline. One of the consultants said it was hard to believe someone in her position could be so careless. The other simply laughed and called it disappointing. Lenora stepped in, asked for a copy, and read it carefully. It was a template she had used before, but the version they showed her had been altered. Her tone was wrong, her formatting inconsistent. Even the signature block had her old title listed, Junior Analyst, Learning Integration, a title she hadn't held in 5 years. By Thursday morning, 2 more departments had flagged memos they claimed were sent by Lenora. Each document contained subtle errors, enough to cast doubt, but not enough to be deemed fraudulent. Her inbox remained disabled, which meant she had no access to sent messages, and every time she inquired about IT access, she was met with polite shrugs or told to file another ticket. She was summoned to a conference room near HR, where 3 people she had never worked with before questioned her about her processes. They didn't accuse her outright. They merely asked her to explain her approach to documentation and whether she might be overextended. She answered their questions evenly, but when she asked to see the original digital trail for the memos in question, they told her that level of access wasn't standard for her role. Her role. The phrase repeated itself like a threat. What exactly was her role now? Officially, she was still an analyst, yet she had no team, no assignments, and now no control over her own communications. Her voice had been hijacked, and her presence distorted. People who once nodded to her in hallways now averted their gaze or whispered after she passed. She saw her own shadow moving around the company, detached from her body, leaving smudges where she had never been. It was more than erasure. Now, it was inversion. The image of Lenora was being rewritten, not as absent, but as incompetent, untrustworthy, unstable. By the end of the week, she received a printed calendar invite slipped under her archive door. It was for a performance calibration discussion. The location was marked as Room C12, a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the executive elevator. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being called into a meeting to explain her declining performance based on communications she hadn't sent, memos she hadn't written, and a profile photo that wasn't even current. She prepared no defense. Instead, she gathered copies of the altered memos, timestamps from the HR portal, and a handwritten chart of each moment her identity had been misrepresented over the last 12 days. She didn't expect the meeting to change anything. She simply wanted the evidence to exist in one place where someone might one day see it for what it was. When she entered the meeting room, Dorian Wexler sat at the far end, arms folded, flanked by 2 HR reps and a culture liaison who wouldn't meet her eyes. Dorian smiled without humor and welcomed her in a voice used for customer calls and charity fundraisers. The questions were polite but layered with suggestion. Was she feeling overwhelmed? Had she considered requesting a development mentor? Did she understand how important tone and accuracy were in cross-departmental communication? She answered each question evenly, refused to be baited into emotion, and at the end, handed over her documents. Dorian flipped through them with mock interest, nodded slowly, and said they'd be added to the ongoing review. The tone was final. The meeting was theater. Over the weekend, she had considered calling the corporate integrity hotline, but dismissed at the moment the thought formed. The system was not built for her defense. It was a funnel, and once inside it, she would be sealed, processed, and filed in a category meant to strip her final claim to reason. So she showed up without protest, to a role undefined and a space unwanted. The basement archive still stood waiting, humming with artificial cold, its walls unchanging, its silence dependable in a way nothing above it was. At 10:42 a.m., a fire drill alarm pierced the halls without warning. The lights flashed. A recorded voice calmly instructed staff to proceed to designated exits in an orderly fashion. From behind the service corridor near the freight elevator, a coordinator's voice reached Lenora through the concrete echo. She was told to remain where she was and keep the south exit open until all other teams had cleared. It was phrased like a safety measure, an essential function. She was told it was necessary because she was stationed closest to the mechanical wing. The instructions came from a clipboard handed to her by a junior compliance officer with a neon vest and eyes that didn't quite meet hers. She said nothing, took her assigned position, and watched through the narrow, weather-smudged window as the rest of the company streamed through main exits, laughing, chatting, checking phones. Team leads high-fived interns. Department heads gave thumbs up to the safety crew. Nobody noticed Lenora holding open the rusted gray door beside the shipping bay, her shoulder pressed against it as the wind picked up, tugging cold into her sleeves. She waited there for 15 minutes, then 20, then 30. No one returned to relieve her. No voice called down the corridor. No acknowledgement came that the drill had concluded. She didn't leave her post. Only when she heard the sound of the main elevators engaging again did she finally step back into the basement stairwell and return to her desk. The next day brought the quarterly team luncheon, a catered affair that transformed the open-concept lounge into a space filled with folding tables, buffets, and chatter designed to mimic unity. Lenora received an invite by printed memo slipped under her door with a note that read attendance expected. No RSVP line. No choice. She arrived just after noon, wearing her cleanest blouse and pressed trousers, her expression set in neutral. The room buzzed with ambient music and shallow conversation. Laughter moved in waves from corner to corner. She moved slowly toward the tables, scanning for an empty chair. None remained. Every table was full. When she asked a volunteer by the serving line if there were extra chairs available, the young man shrugged and said they were at capacity. She waited, assuming someone might make space. No one did. She walked to the buffet line and took a plate, only to be stopped by a catering staff member who gently informed her they had run out of serviceware. Paper napkins were still available, though. Lenora stood there for a long moment, surrounded by scents of roasted vegetables, garlic pasta, citrus chicken, and thick slices of bread. She picked up a paper napkin and used it to cradle a sandwich triangle from a secondary platter. She turned, scanned the room again, and saw no seats, no open gestures, no place set aside for overflow. Across the room, a few employees made eye contact and then looked away. Some pretended not to see her. Others glanced once and resumed conversation. She walked to the far end of the lounge where the recycling bins were lined beneath a promotional banner for team engagement. There, in the shadow of stacked cardboard, she stood and ate her sandwich silently, one hand holding her napkin, the other tucked into her sleeve. The bite was dry. Her throat resisted it. She chewed anyway. At some point during the lunch, a photographer moved through the crowd snapping candids for the company newsletter. He did not photograph Lenora. When he passed near the recycling area, he lowered the camera slightly and turned away. She did not move. When the luncheon ended and the cleanup began, no one thanked her for coming. The music stopped. The tables were folded. The bins were wheeled away. She placed her crumpled napkin into a compost bag and walked back to the stairwell alone. On the way down, she passed a group of junior analysts for marketing. One of them said her name, then stopped when they realized she was within earshot. Another muttered something about how she always did her own thing. They laughed. She didn't look back. On Thursday, the aftermath of the drill surfaced in a short note clipped to her desk. It stated that several departments had expressed concern over her delay in re-entering the building after the drill and that her next safety assignment would require direct oversight. The note wasn't signed. Its tone was clinical. That same afternoon, she was assigned to audit expired safety binders in the basement, 300 pages per binder, most handwritten, some stained, all stored in warped crates that smelled of mildew and solvent. Her gloves tore halfway through the second crate. No replacements were provided. By Friday morning, her posture had stiffened. Not from pride, not from rage, but from endurance. She had moved past anger. She now occupied the space beyond reaction, where every experience felt like the next entry in a record kept with invisible ink. She walked into the building unnoticed. She descended the stairs with the quiet rhythm of someone who had lost the impulse to expect anything. She sat at her desk, unscrewed her thermos lid, and drank coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour before. She knew she had become a topic, not in the formal sense of company news or performance updates, but in the informal way people trade glances, speculate in low tones, and invent truth from the friction of assumption and silence. Her walk through the corridors became a spectacle crafted from deliberate invisibility and unnatural scrutiny. Her presence was now defined by what others projected upon it. On Tuesday morning, she was summoned to an impromptu touchpoint meeting on the 4th floor, a level she no longer had regular access to but was granted temporary clearance for, delivered via a paper slip passed under her door with no sender listed. The meeting was scheduled in an open-plan workspace near the design team pods, a location with no doors and no privacy, where passing staff could observe without trying. When she arrived, Dorian Wexler was already seated at the far end of the modular table, a tablet in his hand, and 2 junior associates from HR flanking his side with the distracted expressions of people trained to avoid engagement. Dorian gestured for her to sit. He leaned back slightly, scanning the room as if waiting for an unseen camera to begin recording, and then made a show of tapping his pen against the table. He began his remarks casually, referencing her attendance record with a pointed reminder about consistency of energy. Then he pivoted, without warning, into a commentary about her physical presence. He commented on the way she held herself when she entered rooms, suggesting it conveyed resistance or disengagement. He spoke about her gait, claiming it lacked initiative, calling it heavy, uncertain, passive. His tone remained smooth, modulated, professional. But every word had the rhythm of judgment dressed as mentorship. He gestured vaguely toward her shoulders, remarking that body language had impact in environments built around collaboration and trust. The junior HR staff nodded softly, as if trained to mirror affirmation without comprehension. Lenora sat still, her back perfectly straight, her chin level, her hands folded atop a notepad she did not use. She didn't interrupt. She didn't flinch. But her mind was recording every syllable, every glance, every nonverbal cue of a performance designed to humiliate under the veil of concern. This wasn't feedback. This was theater. And the audience was the floor itself, the open design space, the passing colleagues, the assistants who paused just outside earshot. Her stillness wasn't compliance. It was resistance. Because when an attack arrives without provocation, without context, and without solution, silence becomes the only shield worth holding. Later that afternoon, she noticed her badge had been updated. She hadn't requested a new photo. She hadn't submitted any edits. But when she attempted to scan into the Level 1 cafeteria and the kiosk screen displayed her profile, the image had changed. It was a slightly warped mid-blink photo, taken from an unflattering angle, possibly extracted from an old ID archive. Her eyes were half closed, her mouth parted, and the lighting cast a faint shadow across her cheek, making her expression seem off-kilter, even vacant. She stood there, her badge pressed against the scanner, staring at her own distorted face while a line formed behind her. No one said anything directly, but she caught the smirk of the cashier, the glance of a man she once mentored as he passed by holding a tray. She left the line without speaking. In the hallway near facilities, she stopped a staffer she knew had admin privileges for ID services and asked, with professional calm, if her photo had been intentionally changed. The staffer shrugged, said updates sometimes happened during annual system syncs, and if she had concerns, she could submit a correction request. When she did, the reply from the admin inbox was short. Her photo met the visibility requirements, and no further action would be taken. She forwarded the message to herself, printed it, and filed it in the back of her personal log with the rest of the documentation she had been gathering over the past month. By Wednesday, the posture comments had spread. She overheard 2 interns in the east stairwell discussing her walk, mimicking the way she carried her shoulders, one of them laughing and saying she looked like she was always expecting to be fired. That same day, during a routine fire safety inspection, the coordinator asked Lenora to demonstrate her evacuation posture for an onboarding video, citing her previous role in the last drill. When she declined, she was marked non-compliant in the volunteer roster. The words circulated without her knowledge. By Friday, she overheard it mentioned in a department head conversation near the print center. They said she had become uncooperative. They used the word rigid. One of them said maybe she wasn't adapting well to modern behavioral expectations. In every hallway, The attack was no longer on her record or her work product. It had become physical, focused on the smallest, most human traits: her expression, her walk, the neutral set of her mouth when not smiling. These were intangible assaults, impossible to disprove, designed to hollow her from the inside out. She began to feel the heat of judgment not when she erred, but when she simply moved. The identity she had once held, quiet, consistent, exacting, had been inverted into suspicion, unreadability, threat. Her stillness, once respected, was now used against her. And every manipulated image, every passive comment, every whispered mimicry added weight to the myth being written in her absence. She noticed how conversations trailed off when she approached and resumed just after she passed. She noticed that her presence, once simply tolerated, now seemed burdensome to others, as though her existence cast a shadow over their comfort. Still, she continued to arrive each morning before 8, placing her thermos on the desk in the basement archive, logging every incident in her notes, every verbal jab, every false memo, every misuse of her image and name. She didn't know when she'd use the evidence, only that the story would one day be measured in weight, not volume, and she was determined to tip the scale. Midweek brought an all-hands operations meeting on the executive level, one of the few events that required the entire corporate staff to gather in the Tier 1 conference hall. The room itself was oversized, glass-walled, and coldly modern, designed more for optics than acoustics, with polished metal beams and light reflective surfaces that exposed every flaw, every moment of hesitation. Lenora received the meeting invite in print, with a bold line beneath her name stating special participant. She arrived early, seating herself near the back, hoping to remain out of view. But 5 minutes before the session began, a junior coordinator approached and told her she had been moved to the presenter's queue. The woman's voice was thin and rehearsed. She handed Lenora a printout with quarterly financial figures and 2 highlighted sections labeled Loss Factors Division 3 and Legacy Accounts. Lenora blinked once, processing, then rose from her seat without argument. When Dorian Wexler opened the meeting, he began with a warm smile and a tone drenched in false empathy. He welcomed the attendees, praised the leadership team, and emphasized the importance of humility and accountability. Then, with a glint of manufactured regret in his voice, he announced that some of the reporting duties would be shared with ground-level contributors to foster greater transparency and team alignment. He called Lenora by name. She stood slowly, stepped to the podium under the fluorescent glare, and read the numbers she had been handed. Figures that reflected client attrition, cost overruns, and departmental overspending in portfolios she had never once touched. As she read aloud, she felt the weight of their stares, the confusion in some, the amusement in others, the smug satisfaction in a few who now saw her not as a mystery, but as an exposed failure. Her voice remained level. She didn't stumble. She didn't flinch. She read every number, every line, every percentage, until the end of the page. She returned to her seat and remained motionless through the remainder of the meeting. When it concluded, the room emptied in waves, staff filtering out in low conversation. But Dorian called her name again, without looking at her, instructing her to remain. She stood as the last of the chairs scraped back and the doors closed. Alone with him, she watched as he gestured to the glass whiteboard spanning the back wall. It still bore the marker notes from his opening remarks, talking points about growth, synergy, momentum. He handed her a cloth and a bottle of cleaner, then walked out. He didn't look back. She erased every word by hand, her fingers aching from the pressure, the chemical scent rising in faint clouds around her. When she finished, her reflection stared back at her from the wiped glass, distorted, faint, but undeniably alone. The next day came the inspection. It was framed as a random facilities compliance check, though only a handful of employees were pulled for it, and Lenora's name topped the list. A representative from HR and a facilities supervisor stood near the main lounge, checking uniforms, ID badges, and basic appearance standards. Lenora wore what she always did, a clean button-down, press slacks, neutral tones. Still, when she stepped forward, Dorian appeared beside the group, arms crossed, and tilted his head as he examined her. He made a show of pointing to her collar. then her shoes, then her ID badge. He spoke in a tone that balanced humor and authority, announcing that she had fallen short of internal presentation expectations. She hadn't smiled, hadn't styled her hair in an engagement-forward fashion, and her badge image, still the manipulated mid-blink photo, remained out of alignment with updated staff standards. Then, without hesitation, he issued her a compliance correction, stating she would shadow the facilities team for 1 week to reinforce presentation etiquette. He smiled as he said it, making the announcement in front of several onlookers, including a few senior analysts and a handful of interns. Lenora didn't respond. She signed the clipboard handed to her, took the temporary schedule, and walked calmly toward the service wing. That afternoon, she followed a cleaning crew through the administrative floors, wearing a visitor vest, pushing a cart stocked with supplies she wasn't asked to use, standing beside restrooms as patrons exited quickly and avoided her gaze. By the end of the day, she had circled every floor except executive. She watched the people she once trained divert their eyes. She watched mid-level managers make small talk near her, then pause and whisper when she passed. She took notes in her mind, logged every hour, every name, every step. They thought they were degrading her, but what they were doing was exposing themselves. They thought they were stripping her identity, but what they were doing was tying it more clearly to their own cruelty. The more they paraded her, the clearer their intent became. And Lenora understood something most of them didn't. Humiliation required belief, and she no longer believed any of it. She had not spoken a full sentence to another employee in days, and yet her existence was constantly referenced, reshaped, and reshuffled in the gossip chain that treated facts like suggestion and cruelty like initiative. She sat at her desk, logged the time, and waited. Less than an hour later, a folded memo arrived beneath her door, slipped silently without a knock, bearing her name in bold with no signature. It informed her she would be leading a professional development session for interns at 1 p.m. in Training Room 5B. The session was mandatory, she was told, and she was to treat it as a full demonstration of onboarding protocol. She reviewed the materials she had created months prior, modules on data governance, systems integration, and policy adherence, the kind of foundational knowledge most new hires relied on to avoid their first mistakes. Lenora had authored the original training format, but her name had been stripped from the credits over a year ago. Still, she memorized the talking points again, not because she needed the rehearsal, but because discipline had become her armor. She adjusted her blouse in the mirror of the archive's utility washroom, cleaned her badge, and walked to the assigned room 15 minutes early. When she arrived, the lights were off. She opened the door, turned on the switch, and waited. The chairs were arranged in perfect rows. The projector buzzed quietly overhead. The podium was clean, untouched. No materials were laid out. There were no welcome packets, no pens, no folders. There were no interns. She stood at the front of the room, hands folded at her waist, eyes scanning the door every few minutes. The time ticked past 1 o'clock, then 1:05, then 1:10. At 1:13 p.m., the intercom crackled on. The speaker above the whiteboard emitted a low static before a voice spoke, faint but clear. It wasn't official. It wasn't an announcement. It was a voice. Male. Amused. It said her name slowly, stretched it, added a mocking tone, and asked if she would be taking attendance for an audience of ghosts. There was laughter, recorded, synthetic, but human enough to strike. The intercom cut off before she could move. Lenora remained still. Her breath was measured. Her hands curled only slightly. She didn't search the ceiling for a camera. She didn't call anyone. She stood in silence for 2 more minutes, then gathered her materials, turned off the projector, and walked out. The hallway was empty. The lounge around the corner echoed with idle conversation. She passed 2 team leaders chatting about the budget reset. Neither looked at her. She returned to the basement slower than usual. Her steps had weight not from defeat, but from calculation. The pattern had become unmistakable. She was no longer merely being erased. She was being toyed with. Every act of exclusion had graduated into an act of theatrical cruelty. They had given her an audience with no stage, a script with no readers, a moment designed not to measure her professionalism, but to laugh at its persistence. She unlocked the archive room, closed the door behind her, and sat down. For a full minute, she didn't move. Then she turned to the bottom left drawer of her desk, the one with the warped corner and the rusted hinge. She reached beneath the inner lining, felt along the edge, and pressed a small indentation hidden under a folded corner of veneer. The false bottom clicked open with a sound softer than breath. Inside was a sealed envelope, thick, white, embossed with the Hallbrook Systems executive seal. She had found it weeks ago, hidden among the misplaced clearance binders dumped into her archive with little care. She hadn't opened it then. She had recognized the seal, the weight of the paper, the confidentiality markings across the edge. She had waited. Now she broke the seal. Inside was a single document, crisp, clean, its ink unblemished. The title read, Executive Board Appointment Confidential Confirmation. It was addressed to Lenora Voss. The date was 6 months prior. It outlined her temporary assignment as Executive Liaison for Internal Compliance Oversight, with direct authorization to review departmental operations and audit leadership decisions for Q3 and Q4. Her name had been submitted, reviewed, and approved. There was a note at the bottom, marked private. The announcement would be made internally within 90 days, contingent on preliminary reporting phase engagement. Lenora blinked. The implications settled like weight on her chest. She hadn't missed a promotion. She had been given one, only to have intercepted, buried, and denied. Someone had discovered the appointment before the official release. Someone had realized what it would mean for them to have her positioned in oversight. Someone had moved preemptively. Her demotion to the archive, the badge deactivation, the false time cards, the mocking, the staged presentations. All of it made sense now. They had stripped her voice not because she was disposable, but because she was dangerous. Her knowledge, her ethics, her history, her silence, they had all made her a threat. She said nothing as she passed reception, nodded slightly to the security staff without waiting for acknowledgement, and descended the stairwell to the basement archive with the focus of a surgeon preparing for an incision. The envelope with a board seal remained in her coat's inner pocket. It didn't burn there. It waited. Her steps were no longer the steps of someone enduring mistreatment. They were the steps of someone narrowing a target. By 8:04 a.m., she had opened a terminal linked to the archive's legacy data retrieval system, one of the few remaining machines in the building that wasn't synced to the centralized access cloud. She initiated a local system boot using a password she had never forgotten from her time working as an internal systems analyst 6 years ago. That login, buried in the mainframe sidewalls, granted her view-only access to archived logs spanning 8 fiscal years, including redacted access histories and internal transfer timestamps no longer included in the current dashboard interface. She typed with the efficiency of someone who had never stopped watching, her memory recalling exact strings of code identifiers and cross-file locations. By noon, she had located and cross-referenced 6 separate data packets involving departmental spending justifications and loss allocation reports between Division 3 and legacy accounts, the same categories she had been asked to recite at the last director's meeting. The numbers didn't match. The official reports submitted for board review had conveniently adjusted client churn metrics, spreading losses across outdated portfolios that hadn't been active in over a year. The edits were inserted during midnight cycles, outside of regular batch runs. Lenora isolated the user IDs attached to the entries. One of them was Dorian's. Another belonged to Marcy Devlin, the VP of Strategic Accounts. The third was flagged with an override clearance code used only by the Chief Financial Officer. That made 3 people who had touched the data, 3 signatures wrapped in silence, whose names never appeared on any audit trail shown to the board. Lenora printed a summary of her findings, used a manual hole puncher, and clipped the pages into an unmarked file she placed under a stack of 30-year-old building blueprints. Nothing in the archive was ever checked twice. The rest of that day, she moved without urgency, cataloging paper files, taking inventory of obsolete databases, marking expired document folders with red tabs. But her eyes traced patterns as she worked, patterns of silence, of delegation, of the voids created by people who operated as if erasure were a strategy, not an accident. The game wasn't just about forcing her out. It was about protecting the shell around an internal corruption nobody thought she'd ever reach. They'd buried the promotion letter because the role would have granted her audit clearance. They'd silenced her because that clearance had already been granted. That night, once the building had thinned, she stayed. Not long past protocol, but just long enough for the weight of the building to shift from energy to vacuum. She moved without making sound, crossing to the internal access panel built into the south corridor wall just beyond the freight elevator. She pulled the appointment letter from her coat, removed the sealed directive sheet, and used the embedded QR code to trigger a clearance sequence on the auxiliary badge reader. A green pulse acknowledged her entry. The panel slid open with the resistance of disuse. Behind it was a narrow stairwell not mapped on any current staff directory. She descended 4 levels into the building's restricted archive vault, a substructure left out of new hire orientation since 2017, accessible only to senior compliance officers and appointed board liaisons. Inside the vault, a series of storage chambers held shelves of magnetic tape drives, physical audit binders, and encrypted report packets archived by quarter, not by department. She moved along the racks, checking the tags against her memory, until she found the section labeled Q3 Review, Internal Transfer Histories, unresolved. The entries had been sealed but not purged. Holbrook's purge cycles were delayed due to legal regulations that required 12-month redundancy windows. That gave her margin. She retrieved the binders, set them on a rolling table, and opened the first one. Inside were audit files signed by department leads, some incomplete, some corrected, others duplicated. But the second binder held what she had come for, a flagged discrepancy report noting unusual edit patterns within Division 3's financial submissions. The flagged lines listed 3 override signatures. One was hers. It had been added without her knowledge. She read it twice. Someone had impersonated her clearance ID and used it to validate data manipulation later traced to client reclassification failures. That made her not just a victim of exclusion, but a fabricated participant in financial misconduct. The smear campaign had not just been punitive, it had been preemptive. Her name had been attached to the corruption they needed her too discredited to expose. She copied the flagged report by hand, every line, every figure, onto a clean sheet of notepaper. She made no digital copies. Digital trails could be traced, accessed, overwritten. Paper was quieter. She filed the binder back in place, wheeled the table into the shadows, and exited through the stairwell with the same precision she had entered. As she reached the basement archive, she paused at the door, listening. The hallway was silent. The air remained cold. She stepped inside, closed the door, and locked it behind her. But the moment she copied those audit files by hand and matched them to the suppressed appointment directive in her coat pocket, she crossed a threshold that no amount of humiliation could contain. She now held the coordinates to a storm buried inside the walls of Holbrook itself, and she wasn't about to announce it with a warning. She would let it arrive with no name and no return address, because she knew they had built their defenses to shield themselves against confrontation, not accountability. She arrived at her desk before sunrise that day, dressed as usual, badge polished, face unreadable. She moved through the security gates with her usual stillness, offered no greeting, drew no attention, and reached the archive in silence. She turned on the desk lamp instead of the overhead lights, slid the drawer open, and removed the appointment letter, still in pristine condition. She scanned it using a private copier meant for legal duplication and transferred the authorization code to a portable drive formatted in analog-only compatibility. The files she gathered over the previous days, each one showing timestamp irregularities, falsified allocation notes, unauthorized edits, and signature forgeries, were printed and indexed with page numbers in her own handwriting. Each sheet was marked in the bottom corner with a watermark code matching the ID from the sealed board directive. By 9:13 a.m., she had everything assembled in a plain white envelope labeled Internal Systems Oversight, red flag packet. Rather than send it through email, which would be flagged and scrubbed before it reached the Internal Compliance Committee. She'd deliver it by hand to the secure physical submissions box located near the Legal Affairs hallway on the 3rd floor, disguised as a courier drop for tax documentation. She placed it between 2 real submissions and logged the entry time manually using the clipboard beside the slot, writing down her original board appointment number instead of a name. The code matched the list of pre-cleared oversight designations in the system, which meant the alert would auto-route to the internal audit network without human gatekeeping. She then returned to the basement archive and resumed her routine as if nothing had changed, because on the surface, nothing had. Yet, for the next 48 hours, Hallbrook Systems continued its daily rhythm. Emails circulated. Staff reported to cubicles. Department heads spoke in hushed urgency about Q4 projections, and interns refreshed the kitchen coffee pod inventory with unnecessary devotion. But by midweek, the shift began. It started with a simple system-wide notification, an internal message that read Compliance Refresh Protocol. Phase 1, blinking in the lower corner of every active workstation. Most employees ignored it. Some joked about another security training simulation. But to those at the top, the language carried weight. The phrase Phase 1 meant a blind audit had been triggered by an external appointment holder, and the audit committee was required by policy to initiate a full visibility freeze across departmental logs. At precisely 3:26 p.m. that Wednesday, Hallbrook's network administrators locked non-essential user access across 3 executive-tier dashboards. Notifications were sent not by choice, but by protocol. Dorian Wexler, Marcy Devlin, and CFO Raymond Ellis received simultaneous messages from the audit server requesting presence for an unscheduled compliance review in Room 7C. Security badges for all 3 were restricted to that floor until the meeting concluded. They arrived separately, their usual composure dulled by the abruptness of the summons. Dorian walked with a practiced calm. Marcy frowned behind her glasses as she scrolled through her locked tablet, and Raymond muttered under his breath with the arrogance of someone who had never once been held to consequence. Inside Room 7C, the committee was already seated, their folders thick with content, their expressions unreadable. The review began without formalities. The committee opened the white envelope marked with the internal oversight code and spread its contents across the table. Within minutes, the tone in the room shifted. Dorian's shoulders tightened. Marcy's eyes narrowed. Raymond leaned forward, speaking in measured tones about reporting frameworks and delegated approvals, but none of the words matched the documents in front of him. Each page, annotated by hand, showed not just errors, but deliberate patterns. Edit logs matching user IDs, access records falsified to create a trail of plausible deniability, and compliance clearance codes reused in timestamp sequences that were impossible to explain without implicating someone with direct internal access. Then came the signature forgeries. Lenora's name, replicated 3 times across adjustment entries she had never seen, tied directly to falsified reallocations now exposed as financial fraud. In the basement, Lenora heard the change not through whispers, but through system lag. The archive server, normally immune to real-time network fluctuations, began slowing. Access requests from executive terminals pinged her log console, trying to cross-reference stored documents. 3 of the ping sources were from legal. 1 was from audit. She said nothing, answered no one, logged the activity, and continued alphabetizing hard copy training waivers that hadn't been touched in half a decade. Upstairs, silence pressed thick in Room 7C. Each executive now faced a complete data trail that could not be explained away by routine error or delegation. The documents showed not just negligence, but coordination. The reallocation scheme had diverted accountability away from current revenue gaps by spreading losses across dormant portfolios. Portfolios no longer monitored by real-time metrics, but still on the books long enough to be manipulated. The fraud wasn't sophisticated because it didn't need to be. It was simple, and it had remained hidden only because no one had been allowed close enough to challenge it. Until Lenora. By evening, a second system notification rolled out, this time labeled Compliance Alert, Internal Audit Escalation. Dorian's badge privileges were suspended pending review. Marcy was instructed to remain off-site. Raymond was issued a temporary advisory freeze on departmental approvals. Staff began to notice. The quiet whisper network flared to life, fueled by sudden calendar cancellations and missing department heads. Someone said a board directive had been triggered. Someone else said the archive had something to do with it. Lenora, still in the basement, filed the last of her copies into a sealed case labeled deferred, pending review. Her logbook now spanned over 100 pages, each one coded, dated, and sorted by pattern. She leaned back in her chair and watched the overhead bulb flicker once, then steady. The building above her was no longer impenetrable. It was hollowing. By the end of the fiscal quarter, Holbrook Systems bore no resemblance to the fortress it had once claimed to be. The executive floors, once untouchable, now whispered with discomfort instead of command. The doors to room 7C were never locked anymore, and the glass that once reflected power now reflected uncertainty. Dorian Wexler's name had been removed from the internal reporting dashboards within 2 weeks of the compliance audit escalation. Marcy Devlin quietly resigned under the banner of health leave, and Raymond Ellis faced a public inquiry led by the Oversight Committee, which convened a joint review with Holbrook's External Audit Board. Statements were filed. Letters were issued. Each of them, stripped of their power, found themselves unable to explain how the numbers had shifted under their watch. They stumbled under the weight of their own revisions. The lies they had layered to protect themselves collapsed not with spectacle, but under the steady, undeniable erosion of documented fact. No internal press release credited Lenora Voss. No public bulletin named her the whistleblower. But her authority, her clearance, and the evidence she had submitted stood alone, untouchable in its accuracy. The company's board, reeling from the exposure and trying to minimize further reputational damage, made an internal decision to reinstate Lenora in full, with all back pay, commendations, and a renewed executive compliance title. One that now came with an open desk 3 doors down from the very room where her silence had once been turned into sport. She accepted the reinstatement quietly. She did not attend the reception. She did not give a statement. She arrived on her first day as she had arrived every other day, precisely, efficiently, without embellishment. She hung her coat behind her door, not across the chair. She placed her logbook into a locked drawer. She took the archive key from her coat pocket and pinned it to her badge lanyard, not as a symbol of demotion, but as a reminder. She still preferred quiet spaces, still walked with intention, still wore expressions that offered no signal of whether she forgave or remembered. Colleagues greeted her differently now, some with cautious nods, others with shallow warmth, and a few with averted eyes that understood too well what it meant to stand on the wrong side of silence. She didn't seek apologies. She didn't offer reconciliation. She worked. Her work was flawless. 3 months passed. Holbrook's internal policies were rewritten. Compliance protocol was restructured to include third-party review. Training modules were updated to emphasize ethical reporting and non-retaliatory protections. The archive floor was no longer treated as exile. It became a required stop during orientation, where new hires learned how much of a company's truth could be hidden in the dust beneath digital files. They passed through the space Lenora had once been buried in without knowing its history. She didn't correct them. The silence was enough. Then, one spring morning, without announcement or fanfare, Dorian Wexler returned to Holbrook Systems. Not through a leadership track, not with a contract negotiated in boardrooms, but as a mid-level process analyst hired through a regional staffing firm contracted to assist with compliance recovery. His badge had no executive clearance. His desk faced a glass wall. His access was timed. His login ID carried none of the override permissions he had once used like a scalpel. He arrived early, not because he wanted to, but because late arrivals were flagged now. His voice was quiet, his posture straight, but unassuming. He said little. He asked questions when appropriate. He corrected his own reports before submission. He never mentioned the past, and no one asked him to. For weeks, Lenora did not speak to him. Their paths crossed once, in the elevator between the audit floor and archives. He nodded. She looked past him. That was all. He did not follow. He did not try again. He took his seat, reviewed his files, adjusted formulas, and submitted summaries that were checked twice before approval. He never entered a room first. He never spoke without raising his hand in meetings. He operated as a man rebuilding a language he had once misused so fluently. One Tuesday afternoon, during a reprocessing audit of old Division 3 portfolios, Dorian was assigned to verify cross-file data recovered from legacy storage. The assignment led him back to the lower archives, now maintained under Lenora's structure. He moved through the metal cabinets with slow purpose, handling each folder with deliberate care, as if the paper itself remembered everything he wished could be forgotten. Near the back wall, in a crate marked Q3 rear view hold, he found a white binder with no label, only a slip inside that bore his name. Not typed, written by hand. Inside the binder on the first page, beneath a list of index dates and figures, was a single line of ink in Lenora's unmistakable handwriting. Truth waits longer than lies can stand. There were no accusations, no explanations, no signature, just that line. He closed the binder slowly and placed it back in the crate. He said nothing to anyone. Later that day, he paused in the hallway outside the archive room. He didn't enter. He stood for a moment, then turned and walked away. His steps were quiet now, measured not in entitlement, but in understanding. He would never regain what he lost, not because of the position, not because of the power, but because he had built his certainty on someone else's silence and underestimated the quiet resolve of the person beneath it. In the months that followed, Holbrook ran smoother. Not perfect, not pure, but quieter. Reports matched actual performance. Memos bore names that belonged. Mistakes were corrected instead of buried. New hires asked more questions. Mid-level managers checked their tone. The culture of erasure had cracked, and from the fissures, a different kind of accountability began to grow, not just from fear, but from awareness. No one mentioned Lenora in the onboarding presentations. Her story was not told in staff meetings. Her achievements were not framed on walls, but her systems were used. Her protocols were followed. Her standards were the ones new staff were told to meet. Lenora never wrote a book, never gave a keynote, never went on record, but her name remained untouched in the files, untarnished, undeniable. She came in early. She filed what mattered. She answered questions with precision. She passed Dorian in the hallway 3 more times over the next year. He never broke the silence. Neither did she. But he held the binder in his desk drawer now, always near, always unopened after that first read. Because sometimes accountability didn't come from headlines or discipline memos or viral apologies. Sometimes it came from understanding that the quietest person in the room saw everything, remembered everything, and chose not to destroy you even when they could have. Lenora had let the truth speak for her. And once it spoke, it had done what no accusation ever could. It had waited longer than their lies had lasted. The end. If you're finding this story gripping so far, make sure to like and subscribe. It helps more than you think. I'd love to know your thoughts about the twists and turns so far. What did you think of Lenora's quiet resistance? Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know which part hit you the hardest or what you think might happen next. Your feedback shapes what comes after.